when you're done, because you're going to be in this panel, I'll just take the mic because I'm going to run it back up there.
So I can use this for now or this?
Actually, this one will be live. Okay. It'll be perfect, and you won't be able to. Okay. Do you know which one this is? And it's not.
You're not connecting to Earth.
No mic on here? Yeah? All right. So let me welcome you to the next session. I'm Art Caplan from the University of Pennsylvania Center for Bioethics, and along with Francis, one of the organizations that is sponsoring this event, and very happy to do so. When Charles Camosi was up here, he noted that many speakers had declined their usual fees to be speakers. I'm not a speaker. I'm a moderator, but it wasn't due to fees. I also have an observation about finding common ground in Princeton. Princeton, you know, does a lot in the area of bioethics with Penn, but never had I understood the sacrifice that Princeton students make by sitting on that kind of a seat. If you want to find common ground, it's trying to get up to that seat from there. All right. We have a panel that I think will move toward perhaps a little bit different style of engagement than you saw in the previous panel. We have three distinguished philosophers. I'm not actually going to do other than introduce them. Coming toward me at the far end is Peter Singer, who's at the Center for Human Values here at Princeton. Are you still at Monash too? In the Australia? University of Melbourne in Australia. Maggie Little is next to him from Georgetown University, and John Finnis, the distinguished philosopher from Oxford, is the other panelist. When philosophers meet, as Peter said earlier, they are kind, they're generous to one another, but that's before the panel begins. Once the panel begins, people are ready to engage in issues in a civil and respectful manner, but I suspect the topic of the standing of the fetus will get us some engagement. The format for this is we'll have 15-minute presentations from each speaker, starting with Professor Finnis and going that way. And then I'm going to chair a discussion among them for 15 minutes, and then we'll try and come out to you, going to the microphones to ask questions. We may, depending on how many people have questions, do more than one, as the previous panel did, or we may do them singly. We'll see what the level of questions are that come up. Same rules, try to keep it to a question, not a statement. You don't have to express your admiration for any of them. They've had plenty of that throughout their careers. I wanted to get us underway by mentioning 4 questions that I have about the moral status of the fetus that I hope we do get some engagement with from the panel, and hopefully in the discussion to follow. One question that's already been raised as you think about the moral standing of a fetus is, what is the fetus? Are we meant to include the fertilized egg, embryos, implanted embryos, embryos that wind up in artificial environments such as in vitro fertilization treatments in fertility clinics, normally developing fetuses, abnormally developing fetuses, viable cognitively capable fetuses, meaning infants such as anencephalics? Do we include them in the discussion of what is a fetus if a child is born with a significant part of its brain absent due to genetic defect? So the first question in just engaging this is, what are we talking about with respect to what counts as a fetus? And we may find that our speakers have different focuses, but there are questions there as to what makes it into the conceptual category. The second set of questions is what capabilities might a fetus possess that would confer moral standing on it? It's sometimes called moral considerability. So anything that's the product of human sexual procreation, being alive, intentionally created by autonomous agents, a genetic composition that is human, viability to become a child, ability to be harmed, ability to feel pain, ability to suffer, each one of them having different twists, the ability to be social or interactive, some notion of self-awareness, and how does the standing in ethics differ or shape what we consider happening legislatively and in the law. All of you know there are many state laws that try to recognize the standing of the embryo or fetus at different points with different consequences, and so the properties that the fetus might possess become important to explore. The third question I can think of is when do these properties appear? Whatever one thinks are important properties, when exactly do they occur in the process of the growth from conception to birth? I've been involved myself, and we have an entire session coming on the issue of when does a fetus feel pain. A lot of contention around that question. When is a fetus self-aware? Are there crucial biological developmental landmarks that can be pointed to in terms of the emergence of properties, or is this kind of a seamless process? And if we're not certain about where different properties might emerge or when they do, or a range of time when they might, then which way are we prudent in erring given the high stakes involved in granting moral standing to different entities? Lastly, are there any other factors that can confer standing on an entity, such as a fetus, besides inherent properties? And what I mean here is if you're the object of love by prospective parents, if you have recognition in a social way by the community, if you are ensouled. Those are all ideas that people bring to bear that aren't necessarily things that inhere within the fetus but might be done to or might be directed toward the fetus that might arguably lend value. So those four questions came to me in thinking about this area. It's not that anyone has failed to say much about each one of them, and no panelist necessarily will address these, either one of them or all of them, but I suspect they might. But if we can get clearer on some of the concepts and some of the beliefs that drive how we view moral standing of the fetus, I think that will be a great goal for this panel to fulfill. So without further ado, and letting the time be used for our esteemed panelists, I'm going to ask Professor Finnis to come up and lead off.
Thank you, Art. Well, the last time I had the opportunity of discoursing with Peter was in May 1998 in the Philosophy Society at Oxford, right behind the college where we were colleagues for a while in the 1970s. The topic in 1998 was brain death. And we had a fair measure of agreement that the contemporary tests and criteria for brain death are an unsatisfactory guide to determining when death has occurred. But we disagreed about three things. One was the ethical question, whether it's sometimes right to choose to kill living human beings, as Peter thinks, and I deny, because I believe that everyone equally has the right not to be deliberately killed precisely as a means to someone else's well-being. But that's not our agenda this afternoon. It's not on our agenda. And second, we disagreed about whether he had accurately understood the philosophical work of Germaine Griset and Joseph Boyle relating to the third matter of disagreement, which is by far the most important for this afternoon's discussion. Peter wanted, and I guess still wants, to treat the question whether someone is dead as an ethical question, or in this afternoon's jargon, the question of the moral status of, say, anencephalic babies, people in PVS, and so forth. Whereas I consider that it's a question of fact, of understanding, if you like, philosophically, biologically, understanding what it is for an organism of a certain substantial kind to have ceased to be an organism of that substantial kind, which I think is essentially what happens at that organism's death, and for which in turn there are substantial, rather subordinate factual criteria and operational tests for those in turn. The last time I had the opportunity of discoursing about today's topic was at the American Political Science Association in 2000 in debate with the Rawlsian political philosopher Jeffrey Ryman. He's a liberal, as the title of his main book makes clear, but he too doesn't believe in human equality. Peter must speak for himself, but in his publications around 2000, Peter Singer agrees, I think, with Ryman that birth has little or no real moral significance. Ryman's position, at any rate, is clear enough. The baby has no more rights, is no more entitled to respect in the minutes or hours or days or weeks after birth than in the minutes or hours or days or weeks before birth. And so far he and I think Peter agree. But then they split. For Ryman, the child doesn't acquire the equal moral status of having rights of its own for several years, until it started to consciously care about the continuation of its life. Whereas for Peter, as I understand, the moral status of equality and right to life is to be affirmed, I'm not sure why, a month after birth. So on Ryman's view, and I suppose Peter's, if there is to be a law against infanticide, as from birth, it certainly doesn't rest on the moral rights or moral status of the young infant. It has none, but only on the feelings and dispositions of adults. And Ryman is keen to add this: since the unborn child, like the born child for quite a while, has no right to life, the mother's right to an abortion is not a right simply to be relieved of the presence of what is growing in her, or in her body, but it's a right to ensure that it's killed, whether or not it was delivered or expelled alive. Well, again, all parts of that view are rejected by our law, I want to say by our civilization. In 2002, for example, both houses of Congress unanimously passed the Born Alive Infants Protection Act, with the second stated objective of several objectives, I quote, to repudiate the flawed notion that the right to an abortion means the right to a dead baby, regardless of where the killing takes place, unquote. And that was a response to a decision of the Court of Appeals of the Third Circuit in 2000, which seemed to mean that even a fully born or delivered baby could be lawfully killed if the reason for the delivery was abortion. At that time, the Supreme Court had lately declared that if the baby is, say, 2/3 outside and 1/3 or less inside, its mother has the right to employ someone to kill it. The doctor who developed this procedure, Martin Haskell, testified to Congress that in his standard version of the procedure, outlawed in 30 states but upheld by the Supreme Court, it would be possible to deliver the baby fully in perfect health and without injury if one treated the woman with dilating drugs for longer. But he said, one doesn't want to do that because the point here is you're attempting to do an abortion. The point is not to see how do I manipulate the situation so that I get a live birth instead, unquote. Now he was doing this skull emptying of a living healthy baby, almost fully delivered, from a physically healthy mother at 22 or 23 or 24 or 25 or 26 weeks of gestation or pregnancy. My pediatrician daughter treats prem babies of some of these ages. There can be agonizing problems about the futility or medical benefit of treatment, but no one involved in her practice, mothers, nurses, doctors, has the slightest doubt about the nature of the baby as a human person, or consequently about its moral status as bearer of interests and rights, unconscious though it is for days or weeks. So there are babies born, babies half-born, and babies soon to be born. Since 1973, American constitutional law allows abortion virtually completely freely for a further, beyond the prem-baby stage that I'm talking about, a further 11 to 15 weeks. The first time I debated the rights and wrongs of abortion, which, to repeat, I'm not here to do today, was in print with Judith Jarvis Thomson, author of the justly famous article about the kidnapped violinist, the first philosophical article, I think, to articulate a woman's right to an abortion. An article whose thesis about the significance of the intimate intertwinement of the mother and the unborn child has been elaborated and extended since by Margaret Little. Of course, this was 1971, so Thomson, while most strenuously arguing for this moral right, denied that it includes a right to get the baby dead. Since then, hearts have hardened. And she had this to say about our topic this afternoon. I quote her, "I am inclined to think also that we shall probably have to agree that the fetus has already become a human person well before birth. Indeed, it comes as a surprise," she said, "when one first learns how early in its life it begins to acquire human characteristics. By the 10th week, for example, it already has a face, arms and legs, fingers and toes. It has internal organs and brain activity is detectable." Unquote. Well, that was 1971, and since then, of course, ultrasound makes all this much less surprising than she said it was. And once Roe against Wade, and even more important, the case decided on the same day, Doe against Bolton, came along in January 1973, people became more resolute than Judith Jarvis Thomson in denying that what they could see is a human baby is a human person or has moral status. All sorts of stages, and Art Caplan recalled a lot of them for us just now, have been proposed for becoming a person or acquiring moral status. Implantation, development of the primitive streak, brain life, sentience, quickening, viability outside the womb, actual birth unless it was an abortion, formation of desires, formation of concepts, formation of self-consciousness, valuing your own existence, and so forth. But these all cancel each other out, and anyway, with the talk of the threshold being desires or self-consciousness or conscious concern to stay alive, we are now deep, deep into infanticide territory with Peter and Jeffrey Ryman. These are positions that willy-nilly are incompatible with non-arbitrarily affirming the personhood of adults who are in even temporary unconsciousness. And what's wrong in principle with their positions is that they deny human equality, elevating various sub-rational animals of their choice above healthy young babies weeks or with Ryman months or years after birth, and above the deeply disabled mentally or physically. Now, the thing about moral status is, if you believe in morality at all, that is not a matter of choice or grant or convention, but of recognition. If you hear anyone talk about conferring or granting moral status, you know they are deeply confused about what morality and moral status are. The very idea of human rights and status is of someone who matters whether we like it or not, and even when no one is thinking about them, and matters as, whether we like it or not, at bottom an equal, because like us in nature as a substantial kind of being. This mattering is the immediate basis for respect, including self-respect and for guilt or remorse when one betrays another and so forth. It goes with the territory that we call meaning, which transcends times and places and forces us to speak about mind or spirit and freedom of choice. If we're thinking alertly to the realities of the realm of shareable interiority, we know what it is to be a developed and conscious person, a being who finds himself or herself to have a rational nature, capacities that combine intelligibility with intelligence, a nature to be recognized and acknowledged, not conferred. If one asks oneself about one's own personal origins, one can go back to one's earliest memories, and then beyond that to the earliest photographs. But although those are earlier than one's surviving memory, showing one as a center of personal life. And then to the life before birth that was scarcely or not at all conscious, but is recorded perhaps in those ultrasound photos which show you, a white male thumbsucker or a vigorous female Chinese thrower of punches or whatever. Now we're only a couple of months from our conception, but it's certain that each of us here, began before. Unless we're one of the 1%, I don't know how many might be here, who are identical twins, we began as Louise Brown, the first IVF baby, began in the discriminating care of Professor Robert Edwards, who got the Nobel Prize for it last week. She was beautiful then, he said at her birth, showing a photograph of her at one cell. And she's beautiful now. Edwards, in his books, gives a lucid account of the dynamic self-directing unity then of the embryonic being, who even at one cell, smaller than a pinhead, has scores of millions of molecular components, all organized then and there to make him or her, well, him or her, brown, yellow, white, black, and clever or not so clever, clumsy, not so clumsy, by nature. The key concept here is radical capacity. The early human embryo has the radical capacity to think and laugh and pun. All he or she needs is time and nourishment, no more. The actual and active second order or radical capacity written into his or her molecular and cellular constitution to develop first order, promptly usable capacities such as to learn a language here and now. But I wasn't asked to discuss the moral status of the embryo, but of the fetus. You ceased to be conventionally called an embryo 56 days into your life and became, in medical parlance, but it's just a conventional boundary, a fetus, which you remain, for purposes of discourse between doctors, a fetus until delivered. But of course, a website describing ultrasound for expectant mothers doesn't talk about her fetus, but about her baby. And so do her doctors, unless they're her abortionists or think she has been or is interested in abortion. So there's the topic of the moral status of the fetus, and there's the topic of the moral status of the phrase the fetus. About the moral status of the fetus, it's clear, I suggest beyond doubt, after 40 years of intense philosophical discussion, that there's no credible halfway house between, on the one hand, acknowledging that whether we like it or not, the fetus, indeed the embryonic baby from the outset, has the same radical equality of nature that we all have, despite myriad differences. No halfway house between that and, on the other hand, joining Peter and Jeffrey Ryman in denying two things. First, denying that the primary question is one of fact, shared nature as beings all having or capable of developing, given only food and protection, rational characteristics and activities. And denying, secondly, equality or ethical or moral entitlement to rights such as life until some time after birth. And here I think Ryman's position will prove more stably defensible than Peter's in making that some years after birth. But of course neither of them can limit their denial of human equality to conditions of infancy. The denial extends willy-nilly to various sorts of disablement and decay. And each of them goes wrong from the outset in making moral status the fundamental predicate in the discussion instead of predicates of the form person, rational nature, kind of being. Lastly then, about the moral status of the phrase the fetus. I want just to say this. As used in the conference program and website, which are not medical contexts, it is offensive, dehumanizing, prejudicial, manipulative. Used in this context, exclusively and in preference to the alternatives, it is an F word, to go with the J word and other such words we know of, which have or had an acceptable meaning in a certain context, a proper context, but became in wider use the symbol of subjection to the prejudices and preferences of the more powerful. It's not a fair word, and it does not suggest an open heart. Those of you who have an open mind or a fair heart may wish to listen to every speaker at this conference and see whether they are willing to speak, at least sometimes, of the unborn child or unborn baby, and to do so without scare quotes or ironizing. For about 12 weeks after viability, some of those are on the outside, being tended by the pediatrician and everyone else as babies. And some of them are on the inside, still intertwined with their mothers, and being cared for, in some cases, by gynecologists who recognize that they have two patients. And in some cases, as the mother decides in America, or the party official in China, being threatened with destruction by her, or the state's abortionist, as a mere fetus. However extensive the rights, in all fairness, of the mother, and they are extensive, they are no basis at all for denying to the child that she's bearing during these 12 weeks its proper name, her baby or child. What an important article of Margaret Little's calls at one point, and I quote her, being connected to the child in one's belly. So I suggest to you, you might listen. This is a litmus test in words of this conference's motto. Thank you.
I want to begin by registering my deep admiration for those who convened this conference and my support for the mission of it. I've thought now, reflected, written, talked about abortion for over 15 years. And in that time, I have come to believe it is a morally complex topic. I have come to believe that good people believe on different sides of the issue. And I have come to believe that the different frameworks people bring to this issue each do contain nuggets of insight that we can all benefit from by sharing them in a spirit of open hearts and open minds. When I say that I've become convinced of this, I will confess I began my thinking on this topic as what some might call a pure academic. Now, I am an academic. I'm a philosopher by training, and I love my field. I think it has an enormous amount to offer on this and other issues because it is incredibly complex. So some analytic distinctions can really help. Knowledge of the history of ideas and what underlies some of our concepts, where they came from, is enormously helpful. But abortion is one of those topics that academics need to remember, in my view. Should pass the 3 a.m. test. Should pass the test of what can we tell our children we have written on. But when I talk of the 3 a.m. test, one of the reasons abortion is so complex is because I want people to keep in mind the incredible scope and variation of abortion in the real world. So for some of us, the challenge at 3 a.m. is remembering that sometimes the agency that Francis talked about is exercised on the 6th abortion because the woman prefers a boy instead of a girl. Some of you will stay awake over that one. For others of us, the challenge comes at 3 a.m. when we think of the war victim in Rwanda, raped, going to Physicians Without Borders because the person, the healthcare provider in her village, refused an abortion. This is what abortion asks us to grapple with. One variable of this complex question is, what is the moral status of very early human life? Where moral status is a helpful summary term for what kind of consideration does its life present us in terms of what help it deserves and what actions we would regard as impermissible to take to it. It's not the only variable, in my view and many people's view, about what's relevant to abortion. Other panels are going to look at questions such as taking account of the very distinctive situation, shall we say, in which the fetus finds itself, that of living in a woman's body and needing her intimate nurturance to be developed into relative independence. But surely on anybody's view, the status of early human life is one of the most important, if you will, variables or pieces of the picture that we need to grapple with and fill in. And how you answer this question will absolutely have implications for your view about what law should be, what regulation should look like, and what decency in the face of pregnancy is. In the spirit of this conference, I want not to try to argue for a position, but to simply share, paint a picture of how one person has come to think about this issue in some humility, I hope, knowing how complex it is, and in admiration for the views of many others who think differently. I begin with 3 intuitions that not all in this room will share, but they are the convictions reflected on over many years at 3 in the morning and passing through life, and that I would vote with my feet on at this point in living a life. The first one, that very early human life, and here I will talk about the differences that the stages of pregnancy make. So the blastocyst, the embryo, early on in a pregnancy, to me does not have full moral status. It does not have equivalent status intrinsically as a paradigmatic person sitting in the room, whatever their other capacities might be. If for some reason I had to destroy an embryo or end a pregnancy that was ongoing at that early stage in my body that would somehow save the life of a 5-year-old child, it wouldn't be a close choice. It would seem obvious to me. I don't regard them as having equal moral status. If I had to lobby for spending millions of dollars to decrease the number of the millions of miscarriages that take place, or decreasing the number of millions of deaths that occur from malaria, not a close choice in my mind. I don't come to the table thinking that there's equal moral status. Here's the second intuition. Very early human life, the sort I've just been describing, has value worthy of respect. And value worthy of respect independent of what anybody thinks about it, wants to confer or withhold from it. If, for some reason, and please forgive the crassness, but I am using it intentionally, chicken eggs became too pricey, I wouldn't want our school systems to perform biology experiments on human embryos instead. It's worth a value, it has a value that's worthy of respect. It's how we begin, and that alone, seems to me, brings it under a kind or a sortal that means that it is something that we need to think about how to value and not just dismiss. Here's the third intuition. The fetus, the embryo into fetus, gains moral status as the pregnancy continues. If you're going to abort, better to do it earlier than later. Sometime in the middle, abortion is incredibly serious. And somewhere in there, and I'll come back to those somewheres, a fetus inside a woman's body has the same intrinsic moral status. Intrinsic meaning independent of what she thinks about it, what country she lives in, what planet she's on. You can think of intrinsic moral status as sort of fully portable. If you met up with it on Mars, what would it still nonetheless present to you? At some point in the pregnancy, it has the same status of a newborn, whether it's inside of her or not. Its position inside of her and intertwined with her still gives issues in morality and law that are relevant in a way that it isn't with newborns. Birth is not just opening a door and letting somebody walk out. So issues about medicine and legal regulation, etc., will still be different for the fetus than a newborn, but measured in terms of its status. I would mourn its death as much as that of a newborn. In short, I have gradualist intuitions and convictions. I think that abortion at very early stages should be regarded as elective I think it always represents a loss, precisely because early human life has value. I don't always regard it as a tragedy. I think there are reasons to decently, indeed honorably abort, an idea that many in this room will find difficult. If the pregnancy continues and the embryo develops to fetus, develops to neonate, I think its status increases, as does the other development. We inherit two traditions that make it difficult to defend or believe in or espouse a gradualist position. One, on the conservative side, is the natural law tradition, Aristotle by way of Aquinas. And on this position, status, moral status, is something that inheres in a creature as an essential property, which means if ever the creature has moral status, it always has moral status. It's a beautiful view. It's a cogent, coherent view. It's exactly what the gradualist disagrees with. The gradualist finds just as compelling the idea that moral status is precisely one of those things that develops, comes, and can even leave us. The second tradition that we inherit is the Enlightenment, and it's the view that most liberals on abortion look to. If the natural law view says that status is something that's anticipatory, it's not about what you've already currently achieved or what abilities you display now, it's about your potential, the Enlightenment view regards status as all about an achieved state, what capacities you now can exercise to earn you the right of membership in the community of moral status. And the Enlightenment view, the achievement that it tends to look to, is the achievement of mindedness, that is, of having consciousness or sentience. I think it's a coherent, cogent view with much of beauty to offer it, because in locating status in sentience, and especially rationality, one of its higher forms, it was the gateway to including many in the community of full status that were denied it before, including people of color and women. Both traditions have deep insights. But for me, taking seriously early human life, I have something more like binocular vision. I don't think of the fetus either in terms of just what it could become, that anticipatory perspective, or again in terms of what it is now, what it has already achieved. They exist in my mind side by side. And unless I am paying attention to both, I don't have the full picture. To me, in short, moral status of developing human life is itself developmental, and the status increases as the proportion of potential to actual changes. There are markers along the way, the emergence of sentience matters. Later on, the emergence of a point of view, the early stages of agency where we start to think about giving and asking for reasons and being normative creatures. All of those mark and shift and tweak how we act with each other morally and what we owe, how we value one another appropriately. But the status itself is, if you like, liminal, just as pregnancy is, between partaking of both. Many have argued that this position is inherently ad hoc because it doesn't have any bright line tests. It is an ad hoc view against either of the two traditions that we dominantly inherit. But it isn't ad hoc if your metaphysics itself includes concepts that are gradualist concepts. That is, it is ad hoc only if you already believe that the only categories our metaphysics contains are ones that are defined by discrete stages. If instead you think metaphysics includes what we might call concepts that are emerging or continua, or, as I think of it with human development, proleptic concepts, which means reaching ahead, the status of the early human life, a little bit like, so famous philosopher Warren Quinn talked about, a pile of bricks that's under construction to become a house. It's not yet a house, but nor is it a mere pile of bricks. You don't fully understand what it is if you don't understand what it is on its way to becoming. But it is not equal to a house. It is not equal to a pile of bricks, just so. Against a picture that asks what our concepts are to begin with, it isn't ad hoc. Put differently, I think that pregnancy and early human life is all about gray. Not gray in the sense of a pallid compromise. Not gray in the sense that there aren't hard choices. Not gray in the sense you get to make it up, and just in case you don't want the pregnancy, you can do anything you want. But gray in the sense of neither black nor white. And if the concepts you bring to it, the conceptual tools by which you measure moral status, insist on one or the other, you will look like a pallid compromise. But if instead you think that gray is the fundamental nature of it, and a gray that begins with one shade and ends with another, you think that's exactly what status is like. I think, in short, that one of the things we might entertain as a possibility as we share our thoughts is that one of the reasons it's difficult and challenging to think about moral status of early human life is not just that it's complex and we come with different metaphysical views, but that many of the conceptual tools we were given were never designed with gestation in mind. And that if nothing else, we might agree that the fetus deserves a theory of its own. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This session, I'm sure you'll agree, has a fine structure to it with migrant little shades of grey in the middle. You have to decide whether the black came before the shades of grey or after the shades of grey. Well, I have to say that Francis Kitchen didn't help my case by describing me as the Prince of Darkness. Save me from my friends. Some of you will think that it's very difficult to imagine common ground between people opposed to abortion and someone like me who famously or notoriously thinks not only that abortion is permissible, but also that there are circumstances in which it would be permissible for a physician to decide, with the agreement of parents, to kill a newborn infant. But the very fact that I take that stance indicates that I do agree with opponents of abortion on something that is of considerable moral significance. That neither birth nor viability marks a morally significant dividing line between the fetus and the newborn child, at least in terms of the intrinsic status of the being. There are other factors about that that are relevant from an external point of view, if you like, from the way in which it can affect others, which I'll come to. The location of the human being, inside or outside the womb, can't itself determine the moral status of that being, on my view. After all, as opponents of abortion correctly point out, a prematurely born infant may be less developed than an unborn child that may be legally killed inside the womb. Note also that I just referred to the fetus or unborn child as a human being. That's the second thing on which I agree with opponents of abortion. In the previous session, Rachel Laser said that 69% of Americans, I think was her figure, agreed with the statement that abortion takes a human life. And she seemed to suggest that that indicated that they were opponents of abortion, or that taking that view would suggest that you are an opponent of abortion. But I take that view. I think they're right. I think an abortion does take a human life. It's often said that the key question in this debate is, when does a human life begin? I think that's a mistake. The nature of early human development, and specifically the totipotency of individual embryonic cells, does give, as John Finnis suggested, perhaps some grounds for doubting whether a human life begins at conception. But if we move to, say, 14 days after conception, when the possibility of twinning is past, I think it's undeniable that the life of a new individual has begun. And that life is clearly a human life in the sense that it's the life of a member of the species Homo sapien. So, do abortions kill human beings? Well, if we use the term human being in that biological sense that I just mentioned, they do. One of the questioners, I think, in the previous session, mentioned having held up placards saying abortion kills and suggested that he now has a more sophisticated view. Well, I don't want to encourage him to go back to holding up those placards, but I think they were true. I think abortion does kill. I also agree with opponents of abortion and disagree with many who support liberal abortion laws on a third point. I don't think the question of whether abortion is wrong, morally wrong, can be settled by an appeal to a woman's rights over her body. I'm not going to say much about this now, as it's going to be discussed in the next session. But I will say this. If we are to discuss this issue in terms of rights, which is one choice, I don't think we have to do that, but if we are, then our rights over our own bodies are not, in my view, absolute. They must be balanced by a consideration of the rights of others affected. If the unborn child or fetus has the same right to life as any one of us, then to preserve that right to life, some temporary restriction of a woman's rights over her body would seem justifiable. At least that seems to be a highly arguable case, in my view. So there are three important points of common ground between me and many opponents of abortion. And a fourth is going to emerge in the final session of this conference tomorrow, but that's another topic altogether. So let me then say, why is it that I differ so dramatically in my conclusions from those who oppose abortion? And here's the short and simple answer. I don't think that being human, in the biological sense in which the fetus killed by an abortion undoubtedly is human, is of intrinsic moral significance. Or to put it even more simply, membership of the species Homo sapien doesn't carry with it a right to life. Now that may seem a startling claim because it's at odds with the widespread view that we talk a lot about, sometimes called the sanctity of human life. And perhaps it's also at odds with what John mentioned, the idea of human equality, although I think there's a lot more to be said about that. But there's the idea about, it does disagree with the idea of human equality in a sense that says, just because you're a member of the species Homo sapien, therefore you have a certain moral status and an equal moral status with every other human being, but a status that no non-human being is going to have. And if you think about it, I think it's obvious that species membership in itself can't really confer a right to life on a being. Choose your own favourite intelligent, sympathetic alien from whatever sci-fi movies you like to see, whether it's E.T. the extraterrestrial or Avatar perhaps. Could anyone maintain that E.T. or let's say Neytiri, I think it's pronounced, the Na'vi from Avatar, could anyone maintain that because they're not members of the species Homo sapien, they have no right to life? I think doing that would be quite parallel to the actions of white racists who denied that Africans had rights because they were not members of their race. And I don't think there is any way of defending the idea that mere species membership is enough to give a being rights that members of a different species do not have. So opponents of abortion have to take something else to put in place of species membership. And there are several possibilities. You could perhaps appeal to religious belief. You could say all and only members of the species Homo sapiens are made in the image of God. Or all and only members of the species Homo sapien have immortal souls. But if you do that, of course, you make the argument against abortion depend upon specifically religious beliefs, and most opponents of abortion are not keen to do that, especially in a society in which there's a constitutional separation between religion and the state. A better strategy would be to argue that E.T. and Neytiri would have a right to life because although they're not members of our species, they're like us in certain relevant ways. But then you have to say, in what relevant ways? And in thinking about in what relevant ways, you have to specify these in ways that enable us to decide other questions, not only between imaginary aliens, though there may really be aliens somewhere in the universe, we don't know, intelligent aliens, but also between other real beings with whom we share this earth and over whom we make life and death decisions, such as chickens, dogs, pigs, and so on. How are we going to do that? Well, we might decide that the relevant capacity is consciousness. It's the Enlightenment view that Margaret mentioned. That once a being has the capacity to feel something, it has a moral status that makes it wrong to kill it. If we choose this criterion, then killing a fetus will not be wrong until the fetus or unborn child becomes conscious. I don't want to preempt the panel that will discuss fetal pain tomorrow, but my understanding is that the overwhelming majority of abortions take place before the unborn child becomes conscious. So if we choose this criterion, we will concede that most abortions do not kill a being with a right to life. On the other hand, it will make killing animals, or at a minimum vertebrates, wrong, since they are sentient. So those of you who are not already vegetarians will need to change your diet. Although I do in fact think that all conscious beings have a moral status that requires us to give equal consideration to their interests, I don't think that the possession of consciousness is sufficient to make the killing of a being as serious a wrong as a killing ever can be. On the contrary, in my view, it's when the being killed possesses not merely awareness, but some degree of self-awareness, or the capacity for making plans for the future, that killing the being becomes most serious. The fact that a being is capable of understanding that he or she has a life makes it worse, I believe, other things being equal, to end that life without the consent of the person whose life it is. Then and only then are we ending the life of a being who knows that he or she is alive and can see him or herself as existing over time. Then and only then does the being have any conception of what he or she will lose by being killed, or have any capacity to have desires for the future that are thwarted by being killed. And incidentally, those desires can be thwarted even if you're killed when you're asleep. The desires are merely latent. They haven't disappeared. You don't have to rethink your desires when you wake up. They're there. So I don't think the temporary unconsciousness objection to this view really holds. This criterion does allow us to explain why the death of a human being normally is a greater tragedy than the death of a non-human animal, because of that level of self-awareness and capacity to envisage your future and have desires for your future that most non-human animals anyway don't have. But of course, if we do use this criterion, it doesn't apply to the unborn child. This kind of self-awareness does not appear before birth. Indeed, it's not present in the newborn infant either. I'll come to that point in just a moment. You might immediately object that the unborn child may not be self-aware, but it has the potential to become a being with self-awareness, and indeed with other moral capacities far superior to those of any non-human animal, and this is why it has the moral status of a normal human being. Well, the argument from potential can be construed in different ways. If it's simply a claim that the unborn child has the same right to life as an older human because it has the potential to become an older human, then the argument has a gap that needs to be filled. Because it isn't obvious that a potential X has the same rights as an actual X, in fact it's obvious that often it doesn't. Those of you here who are students are potential graduates, but you don't have the rights of a graduate, for example, to enroll in a postgraduate course until you actually graduate. And there's many other examples you can think of. Another way of construing the argument from potential would be to say that a rational, self-aware being is an entity of great value. And so if we have a being with that potential, we should let that being live. I'd give this argument more weight if we were living in a world in which we were not worried about population limits, environmental constraints, whether we can give everyone a decent life within the world in which we live. If we had a world with the resources of this world and only 1 billion people in it, I think that argument would merit some weight. But of course, that would also, I think, mean that other things being equal, it would be a good thing for people to have children. In other words, that we would encourage people to have large families, where we perhaps think negatively not only about contraception, but even about voluntary abstinence, where people have the capacity to bring up children. The argument that the kinds of lives that normal adult humans have are of value is equally a life for creating more of them, as it is a life for allowing those with the potential to become that to fulfill that potential. So now let me return in closing to the point that I mentioned right at the start, where because I've suggested that a criterion for having a right to life, I have suggested a criterion for having a right to life that denies human infants that right, for they're not born with self-awareness. John Finnis suggested that I take the view that they don't have this right to life until a month after birth. He's going back to a book that I wrote with a colleague in 1984, where we made that a practical proposal for dealing with problems about ascertaining a diagnosis for severely disabled infants. I since in later work said that that's not really a practical suggestion, so it's not a position that I currently hold, but I do think that the newborn infant does not have the same moral status as an older adult or a 2-year-old child, and there I would agree with Margaret that that develops gradually. Maybe the law has to have clear, bright lines and has to take birth as the right time, although maybe it should make some exceptions in cases of severe disability where parents and physicians think that it's better for the child and better for the family that the child does not live. Now that conclusion might make many of you uncomfortable, not only those who are opposed to abortion, but those who favour it, because it's not a politically very palatable thing to say that the position that allows abortion also allows infanticide, at least under some circumstances. But I think, in fact, that's, if you like, another element of common ground. I think it shows the seriousness of the case against abortion, that to argue coherently and defensively for abortion, I believe, does upset some of our deeply held beliefs. That's why this is a serious and important issue, and it's not something that can be lightly taken. So it's highly understandable that people should oppose abortion because they see a tension and inconsistency even between abortion and some of the things that most people, without too much thought, would say are wrong. I think if we accept abortion, we do need to rethink some of those more fundamental attitudes about human life. Thank you.
Now, what I'd like to do is let each of our speakers offer a comment on what they heard. I find myself thinking, in the spirit of our meeting, a comment on the unborn child, the baby, or the fetus. We heard a very interesting spectrum of positions, and I think I'll begin with Professor Finnis and see if he has a comment to make on the other two speakers.
Yes, I've got a cluster of thoughts. One is just about a misunderstanding, I think, that Peter entertains. He said, as I understood, that I suggested that perhaps it's doubtful whether the pre-implantation embryo is a human being. I'm sorry if I said anything that suggested that. I certainly don't hold that. And I thought I had spoken otherwise. That Louise Brown, as Robert Edwards, the Nobel Prize winner, says, she was beautiful then as she is now at birth. She was herself there as one cell, embryo, and 2 cells, and so forth, well before implantation at day 8 or something in the normal human pregnancy. I don't know what stage she was implanted in the case of this IVF one. And his ground for assessing her as a human being, and remember, this is a man who has chosen to kill thousands of these beings whom he regards as beautiful then, as now, Mary Louise Brown, the ground on which he was willing to acknowledge the fact, the truth, that this is a human being, and not just human life in some abstract sense. I think we should set aside the abstract term human life. We're talking about a human life, which is more accurately expressed as the life of a human being. So Mary Louise Brown was a human being then at her very earliest stage, at the very earliest stage that any of us has been. But it's a stage that each of us here was in. And when we were in it, we were essentially what we are now. We were essentially not just members of the species Homo sapiens, we were beings of a rational nature. In that respect, we share a kind of essential status in being and dignity and so forth with ET, if there is ET out there in space. This is not a question about Homo sapiens or membership of a species. It's a question about being of a certain kind, and that is the kind having the nature of a rational being. Now, of course, we know the reason for the significance of that becomes apparent when we are fully rational, when our radical capacities have become actual capacities, and those actual capacities have been further actuated. I mean, we can't just do with the term actuality and potentiality. I have the potentiality to speak Icelandic, but I can't. So I've got the potential to acquire the potential of speaking Icelandic on any given occasion. There are a whole lot of senses and stages of potentiality, and the one that I'm interested in is what I call radical potentiality, having by nature right then and there, now already, what it takes to develop the full capacities, for example, to speak Icelandic. And that is the truth about the status of even the earliest embryo, which each of us was. That then and there, just given food and nourishment, thanks to the mother, that will bring us through to birth, and then care and nurture by her or by her agents or by her substitutes and surrogates, if she's washed her hands of it. Given nourishment and care, we will enjoy the flourishing of the nature that we had from the outset. So that's all I want to say.
Let me interrupt there. Come back, Maggie.
For what?
Opportunity to comment on what you've heard so far. You can comment on yourself as well, but probably more of the others.
Can I ask questions, or do you want just comments?
Sure.
So I do take myself to be in a very fortunate position that the two traditions that I've admired, though disagree with, really are flanking me at this moment. So I'm a little starstruck, if you'll excuse me. I mean that seriously. But if I may respectfully ask a question of those two traditions in the form of these two eminent scholars. So I don't mean them as fatal flaws. My position has weaknesses, they all do. But these are the weaknesses, the worries I have of these two traditions. So let me start with Professor Singer. It's not about infanticide. Before sentience, before it's even got a toehold, no flicker of consciousness. Okay. One of the things I really grapple with is that is probably, science keeps changing, but may well be fairly well into a pregnancy, maybe even like week 22 or something, which is a point beyond at which abortion providers themselves and women think this is a very different kind of action they're taking than taking RU486 at 8 weeks or something. And what some women say about why it's difficult is not just the violence or the intrusion on the fetal body, but that they love this entity. And I wonder if you think that those people who feel that way are committing a category error, mistaking the clay for the statue. Emotions, of course, can be irrational, but is it actually even inapt? It's applying love to the wrong kind of thing.
Look, I think probably what they're doing is they're projecting their hopes and wishes for the future child in having that. I mean, I have three children. I can't recall my wife ever saying anything that suggests that. I mean, it was certainly interesting to be able to feel the unborn child kicking inside her, but basically she just wanted to get it out of there. So yeah, I think that it's, you know, it's a strange notion really to love a being that you can't yet really attribute the kind of characteristics that beings whom we love have.
So Professor Finnis, one of the worries I have when I think of the position that you outline, which does, I think, have many insights. So let's think not of an abortion that involves a direct killing, but an abortion at an early stage that has the woman, let's say she's been raped, so, and I say that both to remind us of the tragic situation she's in, but also to take away issues about any assumption of responsibility for the life. Okay, through no fault of her own, she is now inhabited by and nurturing this early life that has full moral status. Do you think that if she takes medication that stops progesterone, okay, which is the hormone needed to sustain the womb as a nurturing, so it's not a direct attack on the fetus, obviously. Clearly, she's doing it to end the pregnancy, so I'm not pretending that she's just willy-nilly. Does that make any difference to you? It may not make enough of a difference, but does it make any difference? I'm getting at the...
Does it make any difference to what?
Well, to the moral analysis we would give, and you can choose different vectors of that, the permissibility, the monstrousness, the rights violation. There can be lots of different aspects.
Obviously, in terms of monstrousness, it's at the very... It's off the minimum end of the scale of monstrousness. It's not on the scale of monstrousness. If you ask, do I think it's a violation of the rights of the unborn child who's been brought into existence by no choice of its own? Yes, I think it is a violation of right. Do I blame the woman for wanting to be rid of it? Of course not. So, there are questions and questions, but if we're talking about the moral status of the unborn, which is what we are, then willy-nilly it has the same moral status. Whatever the circumstances of its origin. I mean, lots of us came into being as a result of casual, drunken sex, some as a result of...
Some of which wasn't even any good. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Right. You are speaking solely for yourself.
I was speaking with a warm heart open to all.
One very quick follow-up. Do you thereby think that the fetus has a right to use her body, gestational use?
Well,
is that why she's violating its right?
Is the term use her body something that you want to apply to other unborn children? I mean, there's no more or less use of her body precisely in one kind of pregnancy than another.
Right.
So
is the violation, given that she's not doing a direct killing, It is the violation that it has a right to continued use of her body, and that's the right she's violating. And
sorry, this is the rape child.
this is the taking RU486. This is taking a pill that stops my body from providing nurturance.
I'm asking about which child are we talking about? The one who was conceived by rape, or the one who was conceived by drunken play, or the one that was conceived by deliberate, hopeful act of married couple, or the one that was conceived by IVF, any of them.
Let's take, so the woman's pregnant by rape and she wants to stop her body helping this child. Is that, what right is she violating if she is?
She's violating the right of the child to life. And it's the same right that's being violated whether it was any of those babies that I just described.
But as I hear you saying, it may be, in that instance, it may be a justified taking.
Well, we're not here to discuss that.
Understood.
And there's a question of law and there's a question of morality and so on. I don't disguise my view that in the last analysis, given everything I've said, given the fact that rights are something that, so to speak, confront us with the status of human beings, whether we like them or not, I don't think it is within our rights.
Peter, you have an opportunity.
Yes, well, I would like to follow up what John said in explaining that his view was not based on species membership as such, and I wasn't attributing that view to him. I'm familiar with that, but I think it is a very commonly held view. So your view was that if a being has a rational nature, that's what gives it moral status. But your notion of rational nature is not that there has to be any actual rationality. It simply has to be, I think you said, have the radical potentiality for that. And that you think the single-celled organism has. So I suppose I'd like you to say a little bit more about why that, which is after all just really saying it has the genes of a being that will develop, if not interfered with, into this. I mean, it still looks to me very much like an argument for potentiality, and you even said radical potentiality. So given that we have, by most of us would think that we have as many beings roughly, or will by 2050, let's say, when we're going to reach 9 to 10 billion, as many such beings on the planet as we can reasonably sustain, why does the fact that this being has that nature in its blueprint, so to speak, mean that it's wrong to kill it? That's where I still see a gap.
Well, first of all, it's not a blueprint. We're talking about the Constitution. The blueprint is a two-dimensional thing. We're talking about the three-dimensional reality of an organism, which is of the same kind, in the same, as it were, ontological standing as us, namely, and each of us is an organism. Now, we're organisms of a remarkable kind, it's of a kind that distinguishes us right from the outset from chickens and so forth. You've got the chicken embryo in its petri dish, and you've got the human embryo in its petri dish, and they're both one cell, and you look at them and you say, I can't tell much difference, and it's just a matter of the genes in one. No, I say the whole constitution of the one in the petri dish that has a human cell in it, is that constitution is radically distinct from the chickens then and there, and that difference is the difference between having a rational nature and not having a rational nature. Big time, big difference. Now, you say, well, it's totally unconscious, it hasn't developed anything and so forth, and that's true, and it's also true that the newborn baby is unconscious, or if it's very prem, it's unconscious and so forth, and you've got various stages of consciousness and so on. Imagine that when I go back to Notre Dame, I'm diagnosed as having a serious brain cancer, and I'm told that the only way to save me is to have a certain kind of operation that will save me, but it will eliminate parts of the brain that give me all my memories. So all my memories will be lost, and permanently lost. And all my capacities to speak, except the capacity to learn again to speak, but all my actuated capacities to speak will be eliminated, and I'll have several months of complete unconsciousness. and then I'll have to start my life afresh, reforming all my relationships if I can, and learning language.
Describe the experience at Princeton.
Learning all the languages that I can and so forth. Now, would you say that, supposing I choose to go into this and I'm in it, that I've ceased to be a human being, or that I've ceased to be a person, or that I've ceased to be someone who matters, or that I've ceased to be someone who has rights, even though I've lost all the activations of the capacities that I had.
Well, I'll venture one
much bigger than the embryo.
I'd certainly be willing to say you'd cease to be you.
Well, I don't believe that. I think I don't believe for a moment that I would cease to be me. I've been me through and out to the other end, radically deprived, tragically deprived, but still capable, like the embryo, like the one-cell embryo, capable of bringing it on.
Absolutely no continuity with the former self?
Well, yes, complete physical continuity, complete physical continuity, but no continuity of the Lockean criteria of personality. So I think this is a very useful thought experiment. Let's hope that none of us, certainly I hope that I'm not in that position. But it shows, I think, very clearly that we can strip away these questions of what's being actualized and look at the nature of the being. My nature as a being, and I believe my significance, my maturing, my having rights, would remain continuous all the way through. It would not be right for anyone to say, well, he's unconscious and he's going to be unconscious for months. We can get rid of it. Big population problem.
Let me try a question to see if I can just push this potentiality issue a little bit. We now know through science that you can sometimes now examine embryos and see that they don't have the potential to develop.
Yeah.
We know that some unborn children or fetuses also lack the ability to develop past a certain point. If we have an understanding of what this limited or broken capacity is, affect standing? Does it affect standing?
Yes, it certainly affects standing. Put it like this: if the product of human conception, two human cells have come together, if the product of human conception lacks the epigenetic primordia, the very beginning stages of rationality, such that it could never develop rationality, then it's not a human being of the kind that is equal to ET. It's not a person of rational nature. And that's what distinguishes us, for example, from hydatidiform moles and other radically defective products of human conception. Yes, this is a question of reality. It's not a question of us choosing to, confer a status on something. So here's a criterion that works. Having a constitution that gives us the capacity to be rational.
And presumably not just hydatidiform moles, but some humans with genetic defects that affect their intellectual development, even though physically they may look just like any other unborn child, right?
Well, now it does. There are human beings, let's say adults, who are wounded, who are in various conditions of disease or damage, such that they no doubt won't think again or such like. I believe that they are to be described, and accurately described, as seriously wounded human beings, seriously wounded persons who have the right still not to be rubbed out. And I think that defending the view that there should be a grey area about these matters has very serious implications for a lot of us.
In fact, I was going to jump here to ask a question. Maggie, before I ask people to come down, if there are those who would like to put a question, come up to the mic. just because I don't want Maggie to escape the glory of moderation. Most of the signposts that we talk about in the gradual development from embryo to baby, born baby, have vague zones around them. I mean, there certainly are disputes about when the fetus feels pain, when the fetus is self-aware. The neurologists meet and argue back and forth. There are ranges. It's pretty clear that at some point no, and at some point yes, but there's a big, long gap in the middle for many of these properties that you were talking about. Which way do we err?
For what purpose?
Well, we're not certain in terms of permitting ending of life.
Okay. So when we start asking questions that are policy-like in nature, by which I don't mean it has to be about law, but we're trying to make a principle to take to many cases, what side do we err on? To me it matters. What's the cost of each action we take? It's, if it were all free, let's err on the side of being of conservatism, that is, of it might already be conscious, so we err. But decreasing risk is rarely without cost. So, to me, the question isn't
I'll give you a science fact to generate a response. I saw a paper just last week that twins at 12 weeks are reaching out to one another, socially interacting. Now, that's a pretty complicated behavior. And the description itself...
Sorry, do you mean 12 weeks gestationally?
Yeah, sort of in the womb, touching, interacting,
hang on.
Purposefully, moving toward one another.
Purposefully?
So, let's just slow down and pull
I'm just
apart.
quoting the report to you. I'm not saying they were conceptually rigorous about it. It appeared to them, let's say.
So what can a scientist see, okay, versus what's the interpretation of what is there? The scientist will see, and I don't mean here to dismiss possibilities of that everything in the womb is now mere behavior and science. I just want us to go slow here.
And I'm not trying to trap you with a Wittgensteinian raising of the arm dilemma, but the report is there are buddies in there.
So the arms are moving, okay, and that arms are intertwining. These are all things that can be observed. Now, how do we interpret it? When you go from the arms are moving, and even increasing an incidence of the number of touches, right, fine, to social interaction, that's a big leap, okay? So I have a biologist friend who studies octopi, okay? Social interaction or certain behaviors?
Peter?
Oh, I think octopi are highly intelligent. I think they can clearly plan.
Oh, the octopi are actually fascinating things. Yeah. It's true. And their little suckers actually all have little, like, mini brains in them. It's wild. I don't say this to be dismissive of possibilities.
And I was pressing you just because I wanted to see which way we should err. That's why I was asking.
I just wanted to finish that. I don't mean, again, by this, to be dismissive of possibility of rich mental life in the womb. I just want to make sure that we're clear what you see versus how do we interpret it? And when do we become social creatures is actually a hugely important question. Let me just go back very quickly to Professor Finnis' issue about when do we call, I use the sort of phrase early human life intentionally to be neutral, because I want to have some kind of term that we can use whatever other statuses that we decide that this creature has. But some of the sortals, that is some of the kind terms that we want to talk about, really are social kind terms, like when is it a child? Okay, a child is a kinship notion, okay? It's not just a biological notion. An offspring, that's a biology notion. A young version of, that's a biology. But child is a social notion, which means when does the fetus come under the umbrella of our kinship? Okay, fascinating deep question, one that a scientist looking at behaviors can't answer.
But it was the wrong sort of sortal because it's a property term. Life is a property term. You have life or you don't have life. Whereas we're talking about a substance kind of being. So life was too abstract.
All right, let's go over here. I will ask you to say who you are and then put the brief question.
My name is, I'm Patrick Whalen. I'm the president of Catholic Democrats based in Boston. I think it's fascinating to consider the moral status of the fetus in this sort of larger political context, because we're all aware of the fact that abortion has attained a status as an issue above many other kinds of life issues, and part of it is this focus on the notion of innocent life versus other kinds of life. And so I'd be interested, particularly Professor Finnis, just to talk about, does the innocence of the embryo or the fetus or the child in the womb impart some particular higher moral status than other kinds of life?
You know, thank you. I should have asked the panel which they prefer. Would you like to collect a couple of questions, or would you like to go one by one?
For people lined up, maybe it's we have limited time too.
So please
get a few questions.
Keep your notes handy.
Charlie Camosi, Fordham University. I want to also direct my question to Peter. When discussing at which point after birth we would give full moral status, you made it what it seemed to me was a legal or public policy point about practicality. And that's something we're going to discuss tomorrow, actually, I think. So I want to ask you more directly about, forgetting the practical or public policy questions, if a person is a self-aware individual, and self-awareness obviously isn't conferred by birth, and we use mirror tests, as I think you pointed out in your work, to determine self-awareness in, say, chimps or elephants or dolphins, at what point do you think a newborn infant actually would pass a mirror test and therefore be self-aware and be considered a person?
My question's for Dr. Finnis. Does that one cell have the right to be produced, i.e. birth control?
And one more over here.
Is there a microphone? Oh, good. This is, my name is Steve McKochik, and I'm a professor of constitutional law at Temple Law School in Philadelphia. My question is to Professor Little. Towards the end of his last comment, John Finnis implied that your gradualist theory couldn't be cabined prenatally. If I remember, the theory was it's a relationship between actualization and potential. Is there a way of cabining it prenatally? And if not, who makes the decision of whether the ratio is sufficient to apply moral worth to the individual?
Thank you. So let me set this ground rule. You may choose or not to answer the question that you've been asked if you're collecting them in groups of 4 or 5. I'm going to start with Peter and then come this way, see whether you want to comment on things that were directed to you or more generally.
So the question that was specifically asked to me from Charlie was, when do I think a newborn infant passes the mirror test? My understanding is that it's not until after the first birthday, so somewhere between the first and second, I think, that typically they recognize the image in the mirror as themselves rather than as another baby or something of that sort. So on that sense, maybe Jeffrey Ryman's suggestion is roughly right, or at least but you could say, as I said, really I think this is a gradual matter. If you're not talking about public policy or the law, but you're talking about when you really have the same moral status, I think that does develop gradually. And there's various things that you could say that are sufficient to give some moral status after a few months, maybe 6 months or something like that, and you get perhaps to really full moral status maybe is only at 2 years. But as I say, I don't think that should be the public policy criteria.
The question that was directed specifically to me was about the ratio, as it were, between actualization and potentialization. Who makes the decision? When I talk about these proportions, I don't mean to talk about individual people saying, this looks good enough to me. I really do mean to be talking about the status the creature has in its own right that deserves our recognition. Since I do think it's a matter of degree, and mean that quite sincerely and literally, as opposed to just being a vague category, right? What I think is that the status increases as the embryo and fetus develops. That means it takes more serious reason as pregnancy develops. On top of that, I do think there's some discrete markers. When sentience emerges, now we have a new set of considerations, if only issues about experiential evil. And at some point, The fact that others could help this creature doesn't change its intrinsic status, but changes how much we can ask of the woman to forbear from taking action that would interfere with those choices so that it becomes our business more robustly what we do with it.
So does this progression go on beyond birth?
Well, I think it does go on beyond birth for the organism's good. Then I think that interests emerge with self-awareness. I just think there are different economies of things that contribute to status. So an organism has a good, whether it's sentient or not. Interests are things that sentient creatures can take interest in. And then rights emerge as we're creatures in normative space. So the full sense of what status that we all have, I think, turns out to be a very complicated one.
But rights kick in after birth, or?
I personally think certain rights kick in before birth when you have...
not to be killed.
Not to be intentionally killed, right. The complication there is that when something that has a right not to be intentionally killed is biologically intertwined with another person's body, then that means that their fates may be co-implicating one another. So I don't think that the fetus that is inside the womb should be legally regarded as having the same literal set of regulations around it that a newborn does, just because of their situation being different, but their intrinsic status are the same.
Maggie, I'd just jump in to further this. If the woman intends to bring this developing fetus, unborn child, to term, does she then have obligations not to do things that would be harmful? You're well aware of all the statutes that are aimed at drug
statutes,
control.
let's set aside. Legal regulation of pregnancy raises its own thing. I think she has both duties and responsibilities. When you're going to bring a person into the world and their experience in gestation affects the quality and quantity of their life, you don't throw back the quart of tequila, right?
Okay, I was asked whether innocence confers a higher moral status, and I don't think it does. As I say, the moral status issue itself is simply a kind of reflection on the true fundamental issue, which is what kind of being have we got here, and have we got the same kind of being as you and I are right now? But I think we have that from the beginning, and the fact of innocence or not is of some relevance possibly in some moral analyses, but I don't think it really kicks in the case of the situation of pregnancy and so forth. So I don't think it really matters. Does the one cell being have the right to be produced? That's a question like, it's an ill-formed question like, try and calculate the highest whole number. It's a mistake. The one cell already has been generated or produced, and so the question of it having a right to be produced is meaningless. It's a strictly meaningless question.
Rachel Collins, Oxford. This is a question for Professor Little. I'm wondering whether you could clarify for me your methodology. So how one should, or how we decide the extent of the moral status of the fetus, how one, or how we, society, determines the strength of its moral claim. Am I understanding you correctly that it's in part an intuitive process, that we look, perhaps as suggested by Wertheimer, to the way we act, intrinsically, intuitively act, or do we look to our language, or perhaps as Jennifer Miller alluded to our emotions in determining the moral status of the fetus? If so, two questions. One, whose emotions, actions, natural tendencies do we look to define the moral status of the fetus? The answer will vary, obviously, who you're talking about, and it varies over time if you're looking at a majority. Secondly, is it not logically consistent to classify the fetus as having a moral status at different stages? So sort of an absolute moral claim, you used the language earlier of a right. If you're using basically a intuitively relativistic approach to defining that right. So what I would suggest is that perhaps your position isn't grey, but a series of black and white positions.
Got it.
Mario Cardone, Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, Italy. I just have a question regarding the implications of the gradualistic interpretation. Are some people more human than others or better than with regards to developing fetus? If you're going to say that it's not intrinsic, then is it a gradual process? Does that mean that some people are better than others? How do you avoid Nazistic evolutionary interpretations for your approaches? Thank you.
I guess I want to follow up on the question the previous two people asked. What do you mean by the metaphysics of gray? And in the metaphysics of gray, how do you determine moral agency versus rationalizing expediency? Or does it even matter?
I just wanted to direct a comment to Professor Singer, having spent probably 100,000 hours observing and examining and taking care of babies, premature babies, and I can tell you every preterm baby I've taken care of was self-aware, was aware of bodily integrity, was aware of mothers or nurses or physicians' presence, and that you can see that in the nuanced responses of that baby.
Thank you. I'm not sure if that's a question, but it's a bit of information. Let's do one more.
My question is to Mr. Singer.
Yeah, I keep forgetting to tell us again who you are.
Yeah, Father Matthias from Toronto. And what I said before, abortion kills baby, well, I haven't changed my mind, but I would say things differently, right? So it's not what I say, but how I say it that has changed. I'd like to state that. And then, this is interesting to see how you have a theory of rights, and Mr. Finnis has his theory of rights. Yours is based on capacities, whereas his is based on nature. I would ask you this question, maybe Mr. Finnis as well. A king has a right to be obeyed by subjects. Does his right to be obeyed by the subject come from his being king or his capacity to ask for something to be done? So that would be the question. If you can answer that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
All right. I guess we can start with Peter. Come down this way again.
Okay, so I will respond. I think that Dr. Anand and I are differing on what we mean by self-awareness. But don't forget, if you want to lower the level of self-awareness so that you say every premature baby is self-aware, well, then every chicken is self-aware too, right? Because surely chickens respond to their environment just as well as premature babies. So if we have a consistent test for what beings have a right to life, you've become very all-embracing. Maybe you're prepared for that. But I was using, I think, a different standard of self-awareness. The idea about what gives a king a right to be obeyed by his subjects. Look, I'm not a monarchist, so I have a bit of a problem with this question. I don't think he has such a right. But if a political leader has a right to be obeyed by his subjects, obviously, you could say that's procedural. How did he get to be leader? We're in a democracy. We elected him, or something like that. But I do think it would come from his actual capacities. If we're putting aside the procedure, I think we would say it comes from the actual capacities that the leader has. That means that the leader issues orders or has laws passed which are worthy of being obeyed because of what they are and the consequences of it. And not because of the ontological status, as I think John Finnis would put it, of the type of being that he is. So to that extent, I think the example tends to go my way rather than the other way.
Yeah, I've spent 30 years trying to teach my undergraduates in philosophy of law that rulers, kings or not, and let's leave monarchism out of it, rulers do not have the right to be obeyed. Rulers do not have the right to be obeyed. Subjects have a duty to obey just laws and decrees, but the duty is not owed to the rulers. It's owed to their fellow subjects. So I'm afraid, Father, the question is deeply ill-formed in this context. As to this distinction between capacities and nature, I think it's ramshackle. the way you know the way you know the nature of something is by knowing its capacities, what it can do. That's the only access we have to the category nature. But in fact, the only access epistemologically that we have, the only way to come to know capacities is to see how they're actualized. So in coming to know, the order is actualizations, capacities, and thus nature. But of course, ontologically, if you'll give me metaphysically, Margaret used the term before I did, metaphysically, you have the capacities you have because of the nature you have, and you can thus actualize the things that you can actualize. So that again was another not very well-formed question.
So I was asked a series of questions that really pressed on the question of how a gradualist thesis of status intersected with a variety of issues, if I can take them in reverse order. So one of the people over here was saying, if it's gradualist and gray, that means it's not intrinsic. And I want to make a distinction. Intrinsic status is what the creature brings to us, not just our social conventions, but sometimes what it brings to us is something that cannot be understood except as a continuum. That does make it challenging because it doesn't give us bright lines, which we may have to add on for certain policy positions, okay? Not everything about status is gradualist when we do have triggers of rights grounded in something like rationality. Those are things that afford us a kind of in-kind, strict, independent of anything else kind of right. My claim is that early human life does not yet have that kind of protection. Gray is not indeterminate. It's gray. Backing up to the question that the first woman asked about what's the methodology for talking about status. Can you show me where you are? This will be the opposite of what Professor Finnis is saying. I think that's the deepest question, actually, to ask about status, okay? And one of the reasons that people differ on how to think about the status of early human life. It's not just that they've got different views of metaphysics, but they've got different views about how we even do metaphysics, where it comes from. So some people might believe that the metaphysics is given by the universe and we can discover it through our reason. Some people think there's nothing like that and it's all convention. Okay. Some people will take an element that feels very clear from the rest of paradigmatic life, like sentience and the capacity to suffering, and so it builds status out of that. My own view is much messier, which is some combination of Kant, Hume, and Aristotle mixed together, which is something like the following. What is a view about status that we can reflectively endorse living with? It's not equivalent to convention. Oh, it's easier if we do this. But it doesn't just come platonically given by something else. It really does emerge from everything, actually, I think you mentioned. A rational reflection. Emotion, I think, can often be a source of insight and not just disturbance to truth. And when I say live with, I really mean as human creatures. That's the nod to Aristotle. What we find we can live with and think of as a flourishing community to give our children. And it's in thinking in that broad context when I then think about early human life, what it's like relative to the rest of us, what it takes to grow it into a paradigmatic person. I think the best view is the one I presented, but not one that's sort of platonically given, as it were.
This panel is going to have to come to an end very quickly. We're pushing up against time. And what I'm going to do arbitrarily is take the shorter line, take 3 questions there, you all sit down, it's just fate, and not metaphysics, just fate. But let's go fast. Here, you 3 can ask quickly.
Hi, I'm Diana Hort from the Center for Reproductive Rights. I wanted to kind of push a little bit on the subject of the panel itself. Is it possible to really intelligently, thoughtfully figure out the moral status of the fetus without talking about pregnant women? I hear that a little bit possibly from Professor Little and less so from her 2 colleagues. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Nick Curry, Oxford University. Having been married to my wife for 25 years, I've realized there are things that I don't understand about myself, that I have innate attributes that I wasn't aware of before. For the first 12 years of our marriage, my wife was healthy, she was beautiful, she was a computer engineer, she cooked, she loved me, I loved her, she had all these, and all my reasonings gave all these reasons for me to attribute value to her and to love her. Then halfway through our marriage, she came down with progressive multiple sclerosis, very progressive, and I saw her before my eyes lose her ability, lose the use of her legs and arms, lose her eyesight, become neurologically impaired and barely conscious. But the mystery that happened within me is, rather than see her as of less moral intrinsic value, there was an innate quality in me that I wasn't aware of before, that wasn't consistent with my reasonings, my conscience, some innate moral faculty, that I love her more than ever. I attribute greater moral status to her, and the value of her life transcends anything that my reasonings can have. And my question is, if knowing that human beings are fallible, and knowing that people are capable of being deceived even en masse to the point that they can label other human beings as property or label other human beings as rats, and that we're capable of this, and realizing that, and realizing what a grievous mistake it would be if we're making a mistake in not attributing moral value or moral weight to our fellow human beings, and that we could look back one day and look at this as grievous a mistake as human beings have made in the past. Even if we don't believe in God or we're not religious, isn't it wiser for us to err on the side of life and recognize that being that we have this uncertainty, that just intuitively in our conscience, that kind of moral mistake is not a mistake that we want to make. So.
Hello, Alberto Garcia from the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights in Rome. I'm from Spain, so I have problems with Spanish. No, with English.
I have problems with Spanish.
And thank you for being in this spirit. How fair-minded words of the Universal Declaration in Bioethics and Human Rights can you read on Article 8, respect for human vulnerability and personal integrity, and the topic of the abortion, saying, in applying and advancing scientific knowledge, medical practice, and associated technologies, human vulnerability should be taken into account. Individuals and groups of a special vulnerability should be protected, and the personal integrity of such individuals respected. And talking about physics and metaphysics, I was in a meeting launch at Columbia University talking about labels, concepts, and metaphors of this Universal Declaration. If you had to define yourself in solid, liquid, gas, what do you feel you are? Open your heart, open your minds, and if you have to choose a color, what is the color you choose for your heart and your minds? And maybe we can paint something from the spirit of Princeton. Thank you.
All right. You can sort that all out with 30 seconds each. We'll start with John and head that way.
Well, I don't want to add a word really to what we heard from the man who described his experience with his wife. I think the experience was the experience of confronting a certain kind of reality. I don't want for a moment to pretend that the reality as it's perceivable by us of the embryonic life, or even of later development, as we call fetal stages of the unborn baby's life, I don't want to pretend for a moment that has the same kind of evocative appeal as to our sense of value and respect as the man movingly described in relation to his wife. But I do think that his experience of of, as it were, expanding his understanding of reality is an experience that's relevant to the kind of understanding of reality that is involved in making the right judgment. Let's not use the word evaluating. Making the right judgment about ourselves at our very earliest stage.
I'll address the woman who asked about, can we really talk about the status of the fetus without talking about women? It's a question that's near and dear to my heart, one that I've worked on, thought about for many years. I think kind of yes, kind of no. The gray thing, sorry. On the one hand, if we don't understand the position that early human life is in, the predicament it finds itself in is needing to live in and from the resources of another creature that is a full agent. That had better be front and center in a way that, interestingly, if you read Roe versus Wade, you might think we reproduce like fish. Some gametes here, some gametes there, they swim off. Okay? So it's extremely dangerous, in my own view, to talk all about abortion without talking about the distinctive situation that the fetus is in and the position that the woman is in. That having been said, I do think that there are very important philosophical, legal, etc., social questions to take about how we should best understand the kind of status that that creature itself presents us with. And that's an issue that women themselves who are contemplating abortion are often thinking of. They know they're involved, they get that, but they also just want an understanding they're tussling with. Is this something that has a right to continued life? Does it have any pull on me at all, or is it just what I think? And so to that extent, I take the remarks of us here as really trying to contribute to understanding what a good answer to those questions would be.
Thank you. Well, yes, just a very short answer, inadequate to the question about can we think about the moral status of the fetus without thinking about pregnant women. The answer has to be yes if we're using fetus in the comprehensive sense that starts with conception, because thanks to Robert Edwards' work, there are some fetuses, in that sense, embryos, that are not inside a pregnant woman. So we can and do think about their moral status. I wanted to take up the final question raised by the gentleman who spoke about his wife, because he said, mightn't we be making a mistake? And so shouldn't we err on the side of life and avoid making a terrible mistake? Well, it's a possibility. But there are many things that we could be making mistakes about. If you're concerned that we're making a mistake about the value of some human life, we could be making a mistake about the value of non-human life as well. So if you raise that question, I think you better be a vegetarian. Because after all, it was said there's 1.2 million abortions in the United States each year. There are 10 billion animals killed for food in the United States each year. If we could be making a mistake, then that's another mistake we could be making, and a much bigger one.
Let me ask the panelists to voluntarily disconnect their sociability by putting the mics on the table. I'm going to ask the next panel, I think is coming up at this point. I want to thank the panelists. Please give these three penetrating thinkers a big round of applause. Actually, Charles reminds me, you do get a 20-minute break before the next panel.